Most visitors arrive at Hanging Rock asking the wrong mystery. They have heard about the schoolgirls who supposedly vanished on Valentine's Day in 1900, and by the end of this story, that famous disappearance will look smaller than the truth it helped cover. The girls were never real. Joan Lindsay invented them for her 1967 novel, and the historical record is empty, where a real disaster should be loud. No police case, no inquest, no newspaper panic from the time, no trail of grieving families searching the Macedon ranges for missing daughters. The picnic belongs to fiction, and yet the place that carried the story is not fiction at all. Drive northwest from Melbourne, and the land begins to lift into the old volcanic country near Mount Macedon. Then Hanging Rock appears with a strange bluntness, rising above paddocks and roads as if it has been set there too sharply. On busy days, you hear car doors, gravel under shoes, children calling from the path, wind moving through dry grass. There is sunscreen in the air, eucalyptus, warm dust. People look up at the stone and bring the novel with them before they bring the land. That is the first misdirection. The tourist mystery asks whether several fictional schoolgirls disappeared. The harder question is why that invented absence became more famous than the real record beneath it, a rare volcanic formation, an Aboriginal ceremonial place known as Ngannelong, and a history of restricted knowledge that reaches back at least 10,000 years, with some researchers proposing ceremonial activity much deeper, toward 26,000 years. It is a different kind of investigation, one where the false story has to be removed carefully, because underneath it are geology, memory, colonial loss, and a place that still refuses to feel ordinary after the easy explanation is gone. Because once the girls are dismissed as fiction, the first real clue is waiting in plain sight, in the stone itself. Subscribe if you want more hidden Australian history, because this rock is about to become much harder to explain. To see why that stone matters, start with the empty paper trail around the story everyone remembers. A real disappearance of schoolgirls near Hanging Rock in 1900 would have left noise behind it. Police notes, search parties, anxious school letters, reports in local papers, some official trace of families trying to find daughters who did not come home. But when you look for that trail, the ground goes quiet. There is no matching case, no inquest, no period newspaper alarm that fits the legend. The famous picnic has the shape of history because it borrows real places, real roads, and a date that sounds formal enough to belong in an archive. That is how the trick works. It feels documented before it has proved anything. Joan Lindsay understood that power. Her novel arrived in 1967 with just enough uncertainty around it to make readers lean closer. The rock was real, the heat was believable, the school discipline, the gloves, the stiff old manners, all of it sounded close enough to a vanished world that many people treated the book like a half-open file. And once the film images followed, the pale dresses and the faces turned upward into stone, the fiction settled onto the place like dust. If you visit now, you can still feel that layer. At the reserve, signs and paths guide you through a safe version of the landmark. Boots scrape on grit, birds call from the trees, cameras click under the cliffs, and somewhere in the back of the mind, even if you know better, the old question follows: did something happen here? The answer is still no, if the question is about the girls. But that empty archive becomes useful because it clears the stage. Once the invented case is gone, Hanging Rock stops being a literary crime scene and becomes something stranger, a real place whose deeper record was never kept in police files at all. It is locked into the rock's own shape, and geologists have a name for it. Hanging rock is often mistaken for a simple volcanic plug. It is something rarer. A mamelon forms when thick magma pushes up through a narrow opening, reaches the surface, and piles on itself instead of running away in broad streams. It cools in place, contracts, cracks, and leaves behind a steep, broken mass of stone. Stand below it, and the explanation does not make it feel less strange. The cliffs look cut and stacked. The path turns under rough faces of rock, and the air can shift quickly from open sun to cool shadow. You hear voices from other visitors bounce oddly between the walls. A person can be close by and still sound hidden. That is part of the unease. The place confuses ordinary distance. The material is unusual too. Hanging rock is made of soda trachyte, a volcanic rock type found in only 2 or 3 other places worldwide in this kind of form. So the landmark that fiction turned into a mystery stage was already rare before a novelist ever used it. It is built into the stone. Once you know that, the famous images change. They are the remains of a deep geological event, weathered into a maze that can mislead the eye. Rock faces block the view, passages open, then close. A ledge looks safe from below and different when you reach it. The body understands the risk before the mind gives it a name. A small tightening in the chest, a slower step, a hand reaching for the nearest wall. This is where the false mystery begins to lose control of the place. The stone has its own record, older than books, older than local rumor, older than the roads that bring visitors in, but geology is only the first layer. Long before tourists climbed those paths, people knew this formation by another name, and they did not treat entry as casual. The older name is Ngannelong, and it changes the way the whole place has to be heard. Before the picnic story attached itself to Hanging Rock, before visitors arrived with cameras and paperback memories, this formation sat within the country of the Wurundjeri, Ja Wurrung, and Taungurung peoples. Their worlds met around this part of central Victoria, and the rock carried meaning long before it carried a tourist reputation. Archaeology confirms Aboriginal use of the area for at least 10,000 years. Some researchers, looking at the wider ceremonial importance of the place, have suggested activity may reach much further back, toward 26,000 years. Say that slowly, and the famous novel begins to shrink. 1967 becomes recent. 1900 becomes recent. Even the old colonial maps feel recent beside that depth of time. Ngannelong was not treated as open ground. It was a restricted male initiation ground, approached through law, instruction, and senior knowledge. That matters. The point is that access itself was part of the meaning. Who could enter, when they could enter, who guided them, and what they were expected to understand. All of that belonged to a system older than the modern paths under your feet. Listen to the place with that in mind. The scrape of shoes on stone becomes a very new sound. The metal signs, the railings, the picnic tables, the car park dust, all of it sits lightly over something deeper. A visitor today can walk up with a bottle of water and a phone, glance at the cliffs, and think the mystery begins with a missing group of fictional girls. But for thousands of years, the more serious question was never whether the rock was strange. It was how to approach it correctly. Then that knowledge was forced away from the place that held it, leaving room for another name, another map, and eventually, another story. Forced distance is one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story because it changes what disappearance means at Hanging Rock. The schoolgirls belonged to a novel. The people who knew Ngannelong as a living place were real, and the break in that knowledge was real as well. Within 30 years of European settlement, Victoria's Aboriginal population had fallen by more than 80%. The causes were layered and devastating: introduced disease, loss of land, pressure from expanding farms and towns, and frontier conflict that often stayed out of polite public memory. It was a severing of people from country, from ceremony, from the exact stone passages and boundaries that had been approached with care for generations. Survivors from the wider region were moved to Coranderrk, more than 80 kilometers away. On a modern map, that distance can look manageable. A line across Victoria, a drive through towns, a stretch of road. But for a ceremonial place, 80 kilometers can be a world. The smell of the eucalyptus changes, the slope of the land changes, the sound of wind moving between those pinnacles is gone. Knowledge tied to a precise formation cannot be carried away intact like a suitcase. After that, new names sat on old ground. Surveyors marked the land, visitors learned the European labels. The rock entered guidebooks and local talk as a scenic oddity, then later as the stage for a literary mystery. Each layer made the place easier to consume and harder to hear. The old restrictions faded from public view, while the invented picnic became strangely bright. This is the turn that matters. When people ask what vanished at Hanging Rock, the archive gives one answer, the land gives another. The false mystery has no police file. The real rupture left marks in names, distance, silence, and access. Then, decades later, a novelist arrived with a dreamlike story, and the public chose which absence it wanted to remember. The choice did not happen all at once. It happened through paper, cinema, school trips, and repeated retellings until Hanging Rock became almost impossible to separate from the story placed on top of it. Joan Lindsay's novel was published in 1967, and it carried a dangerous kind of confidence. It gave readers a real location, a formal date, and enough silence around the facts to make the fiction feel half official. The book did not need a police file. It had atmosphere, hot stone, stiff clothing, girls walking upward, adults waiting below, a landscape that seemed to refuse a normal answer. Then the film gave that mood a body. Pale dresses against dark rock, panpipes in the air, faces turned toward gaps in the stone. After that, many visitors arrived with images already loaded in their minds. The place cooperated in the worst possible way. The paths twist, the rocks lean over you, voices carry from somewhere you cannot see. Even a harmless group of tourists can sound distant after one turn. A camera strap brushes your wrist. Dust sticks to sweat on your neck. The stone looks close enough to touch, then suddenly, too high, too broken, too full of corners. The fiction found a setting that already knew how to unsettle people. But the popular version also narrowed the view. It taught Australia to look for missing schoolgirls instead of asking what had been pushed out of sight before the novel ever existed. Ngannelong became a backdrop in many imaginations, while its older role as a restricted ceremonial place stayed quieter, treated as a footnote when it should have changed the whole frame. That is why the literary mystery is still powerful, even after it is debunked. It showed how easily a nation can prefer a beautiful false question to a harder real one. Then, years after the novel made its name by refusing a clean answer, an ending appeared that seemed to explain everything, perhaps too neatly. The neat explanation came after the book had already trained people to love the gap. The published novel ended with absence still hanging in the air. No body, no confession, no ordinary answer. Just the rock, the heat, the waiting adults, and a silence large enough for readers to keep entering it. Then, after Lindsay's death, a final chapter was released under the title The Secret of Hanging Rock. It gave the missing girls a strange, dreamlike exit from the ordinary world. For some readers, it felt like the key that had been hidden all along. For others, it was almost a disappointment. The mystery had worked because it refused to become small. Once an answer appeared, even a strange answer, the air changed. There is another unease around that chapter as well. Questions have been raised about its manuscript history and the certainty with which it should be treated. The point is simpler and more revealing. Even the literary mystery has an unstable record. The famous disappearance was invented, the promised explanation arrived late, and the real place underneath both of them had already been carrying older forms of restricted knowledge that were never meant to be solved by a reader at home. So, the rock collects uncertainties from different directions. A novel that looked like a file that does not exist, a sacred landscape reduced to scenery, a later ending that may explain too much. You can feel how each layer changes the one below it, like dust gathering in the cracks of stone. Still, if you walk there today, none of that has to be in your mind for the place to unsettle you. The paths tighten, the stone blocks the sky. Someone laughs behind a wall of rock, and the sound comes from the wrong direction. Because even without fiction, even without hidden chapters, hanging rock has one remaining power. It can make ordinary ground feel impossible to read. The unreadable feeling is where the rock begins to answer back in physical terms. You do not need to believe in the novel's vanished girls to understand why Hanging Rock became the perfect place for that story. Its own shape already does half the work. Inside the formation, sightlines break quickly. A path can seem clear from below, then bend behind a wall of stone. A gap between rocks looks shallow until shadow fills it. Voices rise, split, and return from a different side. On a warm day, the air smells of dust, dry leaves and heated rock. Then you step under an overhang and the temperature drops against your skin. The body notices the change before the mind catches up. This is the ordinary danger that feels uncanny. The same volcanic form that makes the place rare also makes it difficult to read. Pinnacles stand close together, surfaces tilt, crevices interrupt the ground. Some shapes look wider above than below because softer material has worn away beneath harder caps over long stretches of weathering. From one angle, the stone seems solid and safe. From another, it becomes a set of blind corners. It matters because the old restrictions around Ngannelong were never casual decoration. It can be law, ceremony, memory, and practical knowledge held together. Senior people knew where to go, who should enter, and how the place behaved underfoot, under heat, under changing light. Modern visitors often meet the same landscape with a map board, a phone camera, and a few spare hours. So the famous fiction accidentally points toward a real condition. Hanging rock can make disappearance feel possible without requiring anything supernatural at all. A person can be hidden by stone, confused by echoes, or turned around in a space that looked simple from the car park. That leaves one final question hanging over the whole investigation. If the rock itself explains so much, why does the explanation still feel incomplete? The incomplete feeling comes from the fact that every answer at Hanging Rock removes one fear and uncovers another. The police record clears the fictional girls. The geology explains the strange stone. The old name brings the deeper human history back into view. But none of that turns the place into something simple. By now, the landmark is carrying several stories at once. To one visitor, it is a film location. To another, it is a strange volcanic outcrop made from rare stone. To someone listening for Ngannelong, it is a place bound to Aboriginal law, ceremony, and loss. To the tourism version, it is a safe walk with a famous mystery attached. These versions do not sit neatly side by side. They rub against each other. The invented disappearance lasted so well. It gave people a clean shape for their unease. Missing schoolgirls, stopped watches, a picnic that went wrong. Those images are easy to repeat around a kitchen table or on a bus ride home. The older record asks for more care. It asks the listener to think about restricted knowledge, forced distance, renamed country, and a history that was not lost by accident. There is something else. Modern visitors are allowed to move through a controlled version of the rock with marked paths and signs telling them where to place their feet. That safety can create a false confidence. A hand rests on warm railing, gravel shifts under shoes, wind moves over the grass below. Above, the pinnacles still block the view, still bend sound, still make a nearby person seem suddenly out of reach. She was not. The question becomes why this particular fiction found such a perfect home here, and why it became easier to remember than the people who had understood the place for thousands of years. Before the story can close, all those layers have to be held together at once: the tourist path, the novel, the stone, and the old ceremonial ground beneath them. Hold those layers together, and the old question finally changes shape. The schoolgirls do not return from the archive because they were never there. It is the place where the fiction ends and the harder record begins. Hanging Rock remains. Rare stone rising from central Victorian country, a formation that can confuse the eye and close sound around a person in a few steps. It remains as Ngannelong too, connected to Wurundjeri, Ja Wurrung and Taungurung histories, to restricted ceremony, to knowledge carried through law and place. And it remains marked by the rupture that sent survivors more than 80 kilometers from country after a population collapse of more than 80% within 30 years of settlement. So, the resolution is that the most famous mystery was the youngest layer, and, in many ways, the easiest one to consume. A novel gave the rock pale dresses and a missing afternoon. The land had already held thousands of years of attention, warning, ceremony, and loss. That older record does not need to behave like a detective story to be real. Picture the reserve near closing time. The last visitors move down the path. Gravel clicks under their shoes. A phone screen goes dark in someone's hand. The sign by the track still carries the public name, the one most people know. Above it, the pinnacles keep their own silence, catching the last light in narrow edges. A souvenir can leave in a pocket, a film image can fade. The stone stays behind, carrying more than the story that made it famous. If this made Hanging Rock feel different from the landmark you thought you knew, stay with the channel for more Australian histories hidden in plain sight.